from my cold, dead hands.
A mass shooting happened overnight
at Newton Elementary School,
on the campus of Virginia Tech University,
in Las Vegas,
in Orlando,
at a church in Sutherland Springs.
Fortunately, somebody else had a gun that was shooting in the opposite direction.
Every time I heard a shot, I knew that that probably represented a life. I was scared to death.
All of us need to demand a Congress brave enough to stand up to the gun lobby's lies.
Thank you, NRA! Thank you!
This act of evil occurred as the victims and their families were in their place of sacred worship.
Faith under fire, guns out of control in a country that reveres both guns and God. We take a deeper look into a community shattered by an intruder bent on destruction. I'm Lorna Duick, and this is Context.
We have to be very careful that in respecting the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, we don't violate the Second Commandment in the Word of God.
Christians are deeply divided on the possession of guns in the USA. We will hear the faith arguments, both for and against weapons in a culture where guns are ingrained in the Constitution.
I'm Molly Thomas for Context in Sutherland Springs. Now we are in small town Texas where people say there are 2 churches for every gas station. So look.
Context correspondent Molly Thomas reports from Sutherland Springs, Texas, searching for some perspective with Pastor Paul Buford, whose own church service was going on when all hell broke loose just 3 kilometers away. And a response from Canadian gun enthusiasts. Sheldon Neal visits a gun store and a gun control advocate for that.
I do not want as a pastor to walk into a room and it's a military outpost. I don't desire that, I don't want that.
Stepping up security at local places of worship. Do we need armed people in our church services? Suggestions on that from a community reeling from the deadly massacre of innocent lives in their small Texas town. And the agony of having to approach the pulpit after parishioners are shot just down the road. The perennial question, is prayer enough? Reconciling the church and its people after a devastating tragedy. Molly Thomas with that story. And coming up, Bruxy Cavey joins us for a discussion on Jesus and guns. What is going on in the church today? How to make sense of it? That's later. As we bring you our program on this heartbreaking story of the mass shooting in Sutherland, Texas, yet another tragedy.
We had multiple shots fired in Rancho Tehama. That evolved to multiple victims and multiple shots at the school, the elementary school.
Again, innocent children among the wounded, all an unacceptable new normal in America. We have more on that update on our website. Well, the words church and shooting are never synonymous, and yet the slaughter of 26 innocent people took place in the pews of their own congregation. It happened in a town most of us never knew the name of before, Sutherland Springs, Texas. Context correspondent Molly Thomas went to the rural community just outside San Antonio.
A faithful symbol of peace and security used to stand tall in this community, but shards of yellow police tape now paint a different picture. Sunday, November 5th took so much from Sutherland Springs: life, laughter, obscurity, and innocence. 8 of the 26 victims were under the age of 16.
This was not racially motivated. It wasn't over religious beliefs. There was a domestic situation going on within the family and the in-laws.
While motivation for mass murder is still unknown, the incident happened in a place of worship, a place that residents call the bedrock of their town. Sutherland will never be the same for neighbors Kathleen and Fred Curnow. They were the first ones to call 911.
When this started, we were in the bedroom, but I just can't be in the bedroom. It's almost an anxiety, and I start hearing the shots and the rhythm.
I mean, you felt it very, very close to home.
It sounded like it was in my home.
Bullets hit their car and even ricocheted off of their home. At one point, the shooter aimed directly at their property after a Good Samaritan, as they call him, rushed to their yard armed to stop him.
Actually, he just used my truck to steady himself and shoot at the guy.
Nightmares of that day are affecting them physically. The couple is struggling to sleep and even eat, but they say they're not giving up.
Our faith is stronger after this, and I know that when our time to go to heaven, we will go. And so I need to just remind myself, remind my husband to back away from that fear and not let that fear control our lives.
Well, this is the most calm that it's really been in this community. Neighbors tell us that there have been generators running, that there's been international media swarming. Of course, there's been tactical units here as well. And, you know, this is a very peaceful area normally. And so finally, after a few days, this is starting to again feel like home.
Part of that healing journey involved walking through the bullet-ridden church.
It was extremely calm in there. It was almost as if, you know, the Lord was there saying, this is what happened, but
this is okay.
And I thought about the children in the back suffering and the people laying there suffering. And I went in and there was very little blood. And, you know, what that had been related back to me, you know, my husband says, no, when your heart stops, it stops. And so that tells me that the people that died in there did not sit there and suffer.
When you see that the Bible's been untouched, untouched as, it looked like it's there from day one.
There was no dust on it. There were no fragments on it. There was
the cross was
nothing.
Unscathed. It was just completely
You know, there's wood
perfect.
chips all over the floor. There's glass on the floor. You know, it had not been vacuumed up or anything. And for those two centerpieces of our faith to just be intact and untouched,
it says something about it.
You folks are right across the street. Are you going to stay?
I want to stay. I want to help the church get where they need to be. And I think that's my focus now is, you know, I was not a member of the church before this. They were my neighbors for 12 years, and they were great neighbors. And, you know, after this, you know, I told Frank Pomeroy, I said, we'll be at services on Sunday. And he says, okay, well, come on. I said, no, we're going to be at services every Sunday.
Also standing in solidarity is the only other pastor in Sutherland Springs.
We're not going to let this shake. We're not going to let this rip our community apart. It doesn't mean we're not going to remember our friends. Absolutely we will, and honor them in what it is that we do here. But we'll rebuild here, and our church will help this church rebuild here.
Whether the church will physically rebuild is unknown. There was talk of a complete teardown, but for now, a public memorial will honor the victims.
When I hug the neck of a friend who's lost someone in their family, I'm emotional. They're emotional, and that's okay. God gave us emotions. You know, Jesus wept at the tomb of his best friend Lazarus when he died, knowing the power of God and knowing the power of God would resurrect him. He still wept at the loss that he had. And so we're kind of doing the same thing. We weep now, but we believe in the resurrection, that we will see our friends again one day in heaven.
26 friends forever bound together by a sacrificial story of faith.
Two analysts now on guns at church. Reverend Rob Schenck, a senior fellow at the Oxford Center for Law and Public Policy, joins us from Washington. And Reverend Ron Gleason, he's an author on guns in church, a former tank commander, an instructor in the U.S. Army. He holds a doctorate in systematic theology. Reverend Schenck, let's start with you. Why did you change your mind on wanting more gun control in your country?
Well, a couple of reasons. One was two very personal encounters with mass shootings, one in a tiny little Amish schoolhouse in Bucolic, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where I went to aid the families after 5 Amish girls were shot dead in their schoolhouse. And then after that came a moment in my own neighborhood here in Washington, D.C., in the Washington Naval Yard, when 12 people were murdered inside a military installation. And that just brought the question home to me. What is the intention of our weapons when we use them either in offensive or defensive situations? And the short answer to that is they kill. And then the question became, when we go to church, do we go to church prepared to surrender our lives to Christ, to God?
Okay, Reverend Gleason, let's get you to join in here. Your view, do you go to church to surrender your life, or do you pack a weapon to protect innocent lives?
Well, I'd offer a third alternative. I think there's a tertium quid, and that is primarily you go to church not to be entertained or not to take a life. You go with the primary purpose in mind of worshiping God and of hearing the gospel. You hear of forgiveness.
You would approve then of shooting in a church, would you? Like self-defense, return fire in church?
Well, I'm glad you put it that way. I would approve of self-defense because the Bible approves of self-defense.
How so?
There's nothing necessarily a default setting for Christians to be a pacifist. It doesn't mean that you go out looking for someone to shoot. And I agree with Rob that if in fact somebody straps on a firearm, then they must be prepared. If they are called upon to use it, they must be called upon to use it. So my protection of the sheep in my congregation is primarily spiritual, but it is also physical if necessary, and thankfully it's never had to be that way.
Okay, and Reverend Shank, is there an example or mandate from Jesus that we do not respond with violence when threatened?
Well, there are a number of Bible passages I would point to, and I think Jesus' life itself is illustrative of that. He voluntarily surrendered himself and rebuked his disciples when they attempted to defend him with lethal weapons. And then we have the example of Stephen, the first martyr. When the disciples, we know, were armed. They did carry swords and could have come to his aid and defended him. They did not. And we had the first martyr, and of course we believe as Christians that the blood of the martyrs is very much the seed of the gospel. So there are times when we must lay down our lives. I would agree with Reverend Gleason that there are times when lethal force is appropriate and when it's permissible for a Christian to use it, but it should be greatly, greatly restrained. When you talk about certain individuals, the call went out after the attack on the church in Texas by a number of pastors for their people to come armed to church. Well, the church is a family of God, we call it. It's often an extension of our own families, and just like any family has dysfunctional members, think of your last dinner table conversation.
But
we all have
Rob,
dysfunctional
it's been
members.
So many, over 135 shootings in churches alone.
Yes, and that is certainly regrettable, but we have to keep it in perspective. In the United States, there are 350,000 churches.
Okay.
That puts it in perspective. We have to be careful we don't give in to fear.
All right. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Lots to think about there.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
The tragedy in Texas has once again sparked the gun debate. Could it have been prevented? Or have mass shootings become so regular occurrences that we're going to have to get used to it? Our Molly Thomas looked at that angle in Sutherland Springs. Molly, what do you have for us?
Lorna, unfortunately, our team at Context has covered too many of these tragedies. You know, I think back to the pain in Paris in 2015. I remember the shock of Quebec after that mosque attack. And just recently, I mean, Sheldon speaking to survivors after Las Vegas. But this one is different. This is not a big concert venue. It is not a crowded school or even a big city. This is small town Bible Belt, USA, and that drastically changes the story.
You really have to be in Sutherland Springs to appreciate how tiny it really is. 26 lives lost leaves a major dent in this population, 4% in fact, simply wiped out by weapons.
The best thing I can remember about Mr. Holcomb is that he would mentor a lot of kids that were less fortunate than I was. They didn't have parents, or they had a single mom, or they were just in trouble. He just reached out to everybody.
Brian was just one of 9 members of the Holcomb family that were shot down on Sunday, the youngest of which was still in the womb.
The whole Holcomb family, special people, and so special that I don't care what you do, they are the most forgiving and loving people I think I've ever known. And today, I know if they were standing here, they would say, "We forgive."
As predictable as connections are in small-town Texas, so is the ownership of guns. The question now, will added security be needed in small-town sanctuaries?
Large churches in major cities have security details. They're in plain clothes, they have suits on, but they're armed, and they've been that way for decades. And so this hurt because it was in a small church. And I think every church is going to assess who their members are and what's their experience in life and can they help out in this situation. But discreetly, I do not want as a pastor to walk into a room and it's a military outpost.
The church is historically known as a safe harbor, off limits to most military, even during wars. But there's been a spike in recent mass shootings. Attacks in houses of worship reflect this number too. The Center for Homicide Research points to 147 U.S. church shootings between 2006 to 2016. The thread through them all? Nearly half the offenders had ties to the congregation.
In Canada, we come from obviously a very different culture when it comes to guns, when it comes to having any sort of weapon. As faith leaders, how do we respond when we look at the bad choices that are consistently being made and it's hurting people en masse?
We're in Texas, okay, so this is a state where people have guns. So the culture here is not that people have guns, it's what do you do with them? The government had laws in place. They failed the public. That's all there is to it. So should this have happened? No, it should not have happened. If they would have, just to be blunt about it, done their job, this could have been averted.
As we look at other mass shootings, that these things can really be averted as people have assault rifles in their hands.
One of the issues that we live in the United States, particularly in Canada, is we live in a free society. Well, that's a problem because we allow people to make so many free choices that are not just good, but they're bad. You can't police everything. It's just difficult.
Should we be limiting guns then if it's not a perfect world?
Well, one of the things that I think we hear a lot is that it's really not the gun, it's the person behind the gun. Well, that's where Christianity comes in, because we're supposed to, again, be salt of the earth and the light of the world. We're supposed to be permeating our culture, permeating people with the gospel so that their lives will change, so they'll want to do what? Want to do good things and not bad things.
And so the gun debate rages on until we all stop to briefly pause and reflect over the next mass shooting. Is it inevitable? And more concernedly, who will be the victims?
Guns in Canada. It may not seem like a big ticket item for Canadians, but more than 2 million people own guns in this country. Sheldon Neal visits a Hamilton gun store and speaks with a gun control advocate. Is prayer enough in the face of a massacre like the one we saw south of the border? Well, we go to mega church pastor Bruxy Cavey for some concluding thoughts on why there's no guns in his Canadian churches.
Coming soon to Context, a deeper look into the social implications of income disparity. We'll look at solutions to fight economic inequality and the growing divide between wealthy and poor Canadians. Context, taking you beyond the headlines.
Well, note the shocking difference in the death by handgun count in Canada versus the U.S. Over 13,000 people were killed in America by firearms. In Canada, 178 people were killed by guns. Here's our Sheldon Neal with the Canadian story.
Paulette Simmons is co-owner of the Al Simmons Gun Shop, a family-owned business that has served gun enthusiasts for almost 50 years. Located just outside of Toronto in Hamilton, Ontario, people from all walks of life come to this gun store to purchase a wide range of firearms.
Doctors, lawyers, judges, doesn't matter. Anybody can, as long as you've got a clean record, you can get a license, you can purchase a firearm.
After the massacre at the Sutherland Springs Church in Texas, Many Canadians ask, could it happen here? Are our gun laws tough enough? But gun advocates like Paulette say tougher gun control measures are not what's necessary to prevent further mass shootings.
Canada and the U.S. are quite different in our licensing system. In the U.S., as far as I'm concerned, especially with this mass shooting, the fault lies with the military. They didn't report him as being unstable, dishonorable discharge. That would have prevented him from getting a firearm. They probably could increase their licensing to better background checks.
Paulette believes there are many myths about buying guns and ammunition in Canada.
A lot of people believe it's very easy to get a gun. It might be very easy to get one illegally, but to get one legally, there's a lot of rules, regulations.
Legally purchasing a gun in Canada is not as easy as 1, 2, 3. There is a process to go through.
Wendy Sukier is with guncontrol.ca. She says more must be done to control the purchase of guns in Canada.
I think there's no question. Over the last 10 years, most countries around the world have strengthened their gun laws and ours have been relaxed. And we've seen a real proliferation of restricted and prohibited weapons, handguns, and military assault weapons have doubled.
Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale said the Liberals plan to make good on their gun control promise to make it more difficult for criminals to buy handguns and assault weapons by year's end. Back at Paulette's gun shop, she knows the dangers of selling guns, but she is still not deterred. Even after her store was robbed in 2014, thieves drove a car straight through her shop's front door. The assailants made off with a few pieces. The firearms were later found. The thieves were not. Paulette says, for the most part, though, the bad guys will always get the guns.
I would say probably 60 to 70% of the firearms are probably smuggled into the country, the illegal ones. The rest would be acquired through home invasions.
When asked if it's better to remove all guns from the hands of Canadians, Paulette says that's a slippery slope.
Well, if you're going to start to shut down guns, you're going to have to stop rental vehicles, trucks. I mean, how many people in the last couple of years have been killed by the terrorists renting a big vehicle and driving it into a crowded market or a celebration that's going on? You can only control so much, and then people need to be responsible for what they acquire.
For context, I'm Sheldon Neal in Hamilton, Ontario.
In wake of devastation at the Sutherland, Texas church, Canadian pastor Bruxy Cavey gives us a peacekeeping stand on why there should be no guns for self-defense in a church or anywhere else.
Coming soon to Context, a deeper look into the social implications of income disparity. We'll look at solutions to fight economic inequality and the growing divide between wealthy and poor Canadians. Context, taking you beyond the headlines.
While churchgoers around the world endure incredible hardship to worship, millions of Christians attend Sunday morning services across North America in freedom. But after the Texas church massacre, pastors are rethinking how to address the security people need. How does this affect a preacher from the pulpit? Molly Thomas with that story from Texas.
I was in the middle of preaching, and I'm up front. I can see a commotion going on. Finally, the lay leader of the congregation comes up to me and he tells me what's going on, that there's an active shooter in Sutherland Springs. What's unique in a county that only has 42,000 people is the amount that we know each other across boundaries. And so when something like this happens, everybody knows someone. It was the 22nd Psalm. Is written by someone who's very angry with God. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? Why hast thou so far from me in the time of my torment? It's a psalm that Jesus quotes from the cross himself. In this case, there was a great evil. And it's easy to react to that evil. But we cannot live in a spirit of fear. We can't live in a spirit of hate. Evil happens. but we still have to be disciples. And that's kind of what a church is. That we build disciples for Jesus Christ. But Jesus was still faithful, and he's our example, and that's what we're supposed to be as well.
Well, let's end with a Canadian conclusion here. Reverend Bruxy Cavey is a mega-church pastor of 18 different Canadian churches called the Meeting House. Bruxy, you have no intention of allowing armed security at any of those churches. This has been, why, when you hear what's going on?
Sure. Well, for us at the Meeting House, we're part of what's called the historic peace tradition. Anabaptists, Mennonites minus the horse and buggy. We're urban dwelling Amish. And so for us, our line of thought just doesn't even address issues like that. Our flow of thinking comes out of the call of Christ to always be willing to lay down our lives rather than protect our lives. We would say it's always okay to die for a cause. It's just never okay to kill for a cause. And so it's just not the kind of thing that would even come up in our thinking in a conversation.
But these are thousands of people you gather and 18 different locations. And you've seen over 100 shootings at churches in the U.S.
Yeah.
Are you not being a little naive?
Oh, maybe we're being very naive. According to the standards of this world, there is something about the call of Christ that will appear as foolishness, naivete, to say, wait, are you not at least going to use a sword in the biblical context or a gun in this context or in that context? And to have a group of people who say, no, sometimes our job will be to simply die well, never to kill well. And now, I don't want to be critical of Christians who disagree. There's certainly two different schools of thought within Orthodox Christianity. But for us as a peace church, we just don't think along the lines of self-protection, but laying down our lives.
Okay, so why put those values of peace and they're stronger than peace because it's absolute non-engagement on an issue of self-defense. Why make that part of the fabric of being a Christ follower?
Well, you know, there's a lot of things in the Bible that are mysterious or difficult to understand, but the love ethic of Jesus, including the enemy love ethic of Jesus, including an enemy love that's not just attitudinal, but actional, where we will actually turn the other cheek and go the second mile with our enemy to say, I see you in that context, not as a Roman soldier, I see you as a human being who has a burden to carry. Yes, you're a Roman soldier who's telling me to carry your instruments of war, and I could protest that, but instead I see you as a human being, and in this moment, I honor you as a human being, and maybe that will give him a chance to honor me as a human being and wake up to the system of violence that he's a part of. And so we see this as actually the real clear teaching of Jesus.
All right, Bruxy Cavey from the Meeting House, thank you for, as always, a challenging word. Well, from all of us at Context, you can look up these pastors and these ideas we featured on gun violence at our website. Thanks for joining us. Join us again next week. Wow. I'm Lorna Duick, and you're watching Context.
Voters turning their outrage into online worldwide trends.
Quebec has an interesting relationship with race and religion.
We'll never arrest our way out of this problem.
I guess the politics ahead of the people on the front lines is more concerning.
Of course, it's too dangerous for us to go over to Syria right now.
This is real, isn't it? We could be looking at another Rwanda. Well, this is an issue our next guest is an expert on.
I think it's going to be very difficult for the province to follow these rules.
What is the standard that the church asks?
And he said, God's got you. You are protected.
How does that get decided, what the Pope will address? Joining me now is Wilma Dirksen.
What you're talking about here is the treatment of women in media and entertainment industries.
Bad behavior, is it out of control?
God's not a rain god, that he just does what we ask him to do.